It began with a scream no one heard. On the edge of Willow Creek, a small, aging town where everyone knew each other's business, the silence of a winter night was broken by something almost imperceptible. A door creak, the crunch of boots on frost, a muffled thud. In the morning, the frost was still there. But 54-year-old Margaret Ellison was not. Margaret wasn't the kind of woman who just disappeared. She had routines. Every Tuesday she watered the potted ivy hanging by her porch. Every Friday she baked lemon bread for the church sale. And every Sunday, without fail, she wore the same soft blue scarf her late husband had given her on their wedding day. That scarf was still draped over the kitchen chair when her neighbor, Mrs. Daly, came knocking at 8:17 a.m. to return a borrowed tin of sugar. The door was ajar. The kettle was whistling on the stove. The back door was wide open to the cold. Mrs. Daly called her name twice, stepped into the kitchen, and saw something that would haunt her forever. Margaret's reading glasses lying cracked on the floor, and a thin line of blood, no wider than a pencil mark, trailing across the tile toward the back porch. She froze. By the time the police arrived, the house looked wrong. Not ransacked, but shifted. As if someone had stepped into Margaret's world and rearranged it in ways so subtle, they were almost unnoticeable. The framed photo of her and her daughter Emily was turned face down on the hallway table. The clock above the fireplace had stopped at 2:14 a.m. And in the living room, a single winter boot, men's size 11, stood alone, dry, with no match in sight. Detective Caleb Rourke was the first on scene, a man who had worked the Willow Creek beat for 17 years and thought he'd seen it all. But something about this case gripped him instantly. It wasn't just the lack of forced entry or the eerie stillness of the house. It was the way it felt personal. This wasn't random. He noticed Margaret's purse still hanging on the hook by the door, her wallet untouched, credit cards still inside. Her phone was on the kitchen counter, battery drained but screen smeared with what looked like a partial palm print. Whoever had taken her hadn't come for money. They had come for her. Emily, her only child, was called in from the city. She arrived pale, trembling, clutching the arm of her fiancé. This isn't possible, she stammered, eyes darting from the open back door to the detectives combing through her mother's knitting basket as if it might hold the answer. She was fine. I spoke to her last night. She said she'd made tea and was going to bed. Detective Rourke filed that away. Going to bed. No signs of struggle, no shattered dishes, no overturned chairs. Whoever came for Margaret must have been someone she knew well enough to open the door to at that hour. The media didn't swarm Willow Creek. Not yet. Margaret wasn't a celebrity, just a retired librarian who had lived in the same white-clapboard house for 32 years. But in towns like this, every disappearance was personal. People whispered at the diner over coffee refills, replaying every little thing they remembered about her. The mailman swore he saw a dark sedan parked 2 streets over the night before. The teenager at the gas station said a tall man had come in around midnight asking for directions to Willow Creek Road. Rourke chased every lead, but something in his gut told him this wouldn't be solved by canvassing the neighborhood. Whoever had taken Margaret had erased their tracks well, but they'd left echoes. In the bedroom, under the bed, they found a folded scrap of paper. Torn, yellowed, with handwriting so faint it was almost illegible. 2 words, not again. It didn't make sense. Not yet. But Rourke had learned that in cases like these, nothing makes sense until it makes too much sense. And that's when it's too late. He stepped out onto the porch, frost crunching under his boots, looking out at the bare trees swaying against the pale winter sky. Somewhere out there, Margaret Ellison was alive. Or she wasn't. And either way, someone was counting on the quiet of Willow Creek to keep their secret. They were wrong. In Willow Creek, winter didn't just arrive. It settled in, sinking deep into the bones of the town until every street lamp haloed in frost and every porch step groaned beneath the weight of ice. It was the kind of place where people left their cars unlocked, where the post office clerk knew the birthdays of half the residents, and where a missing person wasn't just a statistic, it was a family crisis that spilled into the diner, the church pews, and the aisles of the only grocery store in town. Margaret Ellison had been part of Willow Creek for nearly all her life. Born just 2 blocks from the house she vanished from, she grew up on the smell of pine in December and the sight of the same cracked sidewalks she'd later walk as a grown woman. Her life had been steady, almost predictable. Marriage to her high school sweetheart, the birth of her daughter Emily, a long career at the local library. She wasn't wealthy. She wasn't flashy. But in a town like Willow Creek, her life was enviably peaceful. After her husband James passed from a sudden heart attack 8 years ago, Margaret carried herself with quiet resilience. She wore her grief like a scarf, close, comforting, but never flaunted. Those who knew her well said she found solace in routine: morning tea with honey, a short walk around the block, an hour of reading by the bay window before dinner. Detective Caleb Rourke, on the other hand, had grown up a county over. He came to Willow Creek after years of working narcotics in the city, a move his colleagues called career suicide, but which he saw as a relief. He was a tall man with deep lines carved into his face, a byproduct of years squinting under crime scene floodlights. His coat smelled faintly of stale coffee and rain, and his eyes missed nothing. Rourke wasn't known for his bedside manner, but his clearance rate was higher than anyone in the department. When Margaret went missing, Rourke felt it in his gut. Something about the case reminded him of an unsolved file from early in his career: a woman named Caroline Watts, gone without a trace from her farmhouse 14 years ago. Caroline's kitchen had been found much like Margaret's: tea on the stove, a door left ajar, no signs of forced entry. That case had never been solved. Emily Ellison, now 28, lived in the city with her fiancé, Lucas Kane, a marketing executive with a polished smile and an air of quiet control. Emily had left Willow Creek after college, chasing opportunities and escaping the small-town gravity that had anchored her parents. But she and her mother remained close: frequent calls, weekend visits, holidays together. On the night before Margaret vanished, Emily had called around 9:30 p.m. They talked about the church bake sale, Emily's upcoming wedding, and a new novel Margaret had been reading. Emily swore nothing in her mother's voice suggested worry or fear. Neighbors began filling in their own timelines. Mrs. Daly, the neighbor who found the open door, said she saw Margaret's kitchen light on at 10:15 p.m. The mailman claimed he noticed a black SUV parked unusually far down Willow Creek Road the previous afternoon. A local mechanic, Dean Holloway, reported hearing what sounded like a car door slam near Margaret's backyard around 2 a.m., though he admitted he'd been half asleep. Rourke knew early on that the investigation would hinge on one critical question: why Margaret? She wasn't involved in disputes. She didn't owe anyone money. She wasn't dating. And yet, whoever took her had moved with precision and left almost nothing behind. Back at the station, Rourke and his partner, Detective Marisol Vega, combed through Margaret's recent phone records and found only the usual suspects: Emily, the church committee, a couple of old friends. But one number stood out: an unknown prepaid cell phone that had called Margaret 3 times in the past week, each time late at night. No voicemail. No traceable address. A burner. Vega dug into Margaret's library records, a habit that often said more about a person than they realized. In the past month, Margaret had checked out books on genealogy, local history, and, curiously, a memoir about cold cases in small towns. When Vega asked Emily about it, Emily shrugged. Mom was always into that kind of thing. She loved a mystery. But she read so much, I doubt it means anything. Rourke wasn't so sure. At the Ellison home, the forensic team found one more strange detail: the winter boot left in the living room wasn't just any boot. It was an older model of a brand discontinued years ago, the tread worn smooth in a way that suggested long use. Inside, tucked beneath the insole, they found a scrap of paper, not from a notebook, but from what looked like a ledger or an old diary. The writing was faint, but the words were clear enough: February 18th, never again. It was another breadcrumb. And in Rourke's experience, breadcrumbs always led somewhere, but never where you expected. For the people of Willow Creek, the days that followed turned the town into something unrecognizable. Doors were locked. Curtains were drawn. The chatter in the diner died down to murmurs. And somewhere, beyond the edge of their quiet streets, someone knew exactly where Margaret Ellison was, and why she had to be taken. The third morning after Margaret Ellison vanished, Willow Creek awoke to a town both familiar and unrecognizable. The frost still lay thick over the sidewalks. The smell of fresh bread still drifted from the bakery. But now, an unspoken heaviness pressed on every doorframe and shop window. Detective Caleb Rourke's first stop that day wasn't the station, it was Margaret's house. The yellow crime scene tape flapped in the brittle wind, a warning as fragile as the ice that clung to the gutters. Inside, the rooms had been stripped of their warmth. The forensic team had already taken most of the physical evidence, but Rourke wanted something else. A feel for the house, for the spaces Margaret moved in. Sometimes, he believed, a room could tell you more than a witness ever would. The kitchen was the same as he remembered, kettle still on the stove, faint tea stains circling the bottom. The open back door led to a porch dusted with snow. From there, a narrow path ran toward the woods at the edge of the property. The snow on that path was disturbed, not by shuffling feet, but by deliberate steps. 2 sets of footprints. One heavier, one lighter. Both leading out. Neither coming back. He crouched to study them. The heavier prints matched the tread pattern from the men's boot found in the living room. The lighter prints, probably Margaret's. The stride was short, hesitant, as if she was walking with someone she didn't entirely trust, but not yet afraid enough to run. Inside the living room, the phone on the counter still showed the last incoming call, the burner number. Time stamp, 2:06 a.m. Whoever called, Margaret had answered. The call lasted exactly 42 seconds. Rourke played that over in his mind. Not long enough for a chat. Just long enough for a sentence or two. Vega arrived a few minutes later, bundled against the cold, her breath visible in the air. She handed Rourke a paper cup of coffee. "We pulled traffic cam footage from Highway 6, she said, voice low. "There's a black SUV heading out of town at 2:28 a.m. The plates are covered, but we caught a partial K9-3. Rourke's eyes narrowed. Anything before that? One pass an hour earlier, coming in. Same vehicle. Same covered plate. They stood in the silence of the kitchen for a moment. The only sound was the wind rattling the bare branches outside. Then Vega asked the question that had been gnawing at both of them. "Do you think this is connected to Caroline Watts?" Rourke didn't answer immediately. 14 years ago, Caroline had been taken from her farmhouse in almost the same way. Same time of night. Same lack of struggle. And in her case, the only clue had been a note left behind, 3 words, "Not this time." Back at the station, they called in Margaret's daughter Emily again. She sat across from them in the interview room, pale but composed. Lucas sat beside her, his hand resting over hers, his expression unreadable. "Emily," Rourke began, "we found a note in your mother's house. 2 words, 'Not again.' Does that mean anything to you?" Emily shook her head slowly. "No. I've never seen that before." "What about the calls from the blocked number?" Vega pressed. Emily hesitated, glanced at Lucas. She didn't mention anything about strange calls. But a couple of weeks ago, she seemed distracted. Like she had something on her mind. I asked, but she brushed it off. Lucas spoke for the first time. His voice was steady, almost too steady. Margaret was private. Maybe it was nothing. Rourke logged that away. People who called things nothing often knew more than they admitted. The next break came from the most unexpected place, the public library. The head librarian, Mrs. Conway, called to say she had found something in the book drop. A hardcover genealogy guide, checked out in Margaret's name. Inside, tucked between pages 214 and 215, was a photograph. It was old, at least 30 years. Black and white, faded around the edges. It showed 2 young women standing in front of a barn. One of them was clearly a young Margaret. The other, unknown to Rourke, had dark hair and a wide smile. On the back of the photo, in faint pencil, were the words, "Sisters Forever, M&C." Rourke stared at the photo for a long time. Margaret had no sister on record. That night, he spread the evidence across his desk. The boot, the burner calls, the photograph, the note. Threads that seemed separate but hummed with the same unseen connection. Somewhere in the overlap was the truth, and the truth, he knew, was never kind. Outside the station, the winter wind howled like it was carrying secrets. And somewhere in the dark, someone was listening. Detective Caleb Rourke had been in this game long enough to know when a case was about to turn. And Margaret Ellison's disappearance was turning, not because they had found her, but because the quiet threads of her life were beginning to fray in places no one expected. 3 days after the photograph surfaced at the library, the lab called with a partial match on the boot print found in her living room. It wasn't in the National Criminal Database, but it was close enough to flag a local match from a decade-old arrest. Dean Holloway, the mechanic who lived 2 blocks away from Margaret. Dean had been one of the first to offer a statement, claiming he'd heard a car door slam near Margaret's backyard at 2 a.m. He had also been oddly eager to help search for her, showing up at volunteer efforts with a flashlight, knocking on neighbors' doors. Too eager, Rourke thought. They brought Dean in quietly. In the interview room, under the hum of the overhead light, Dean leaned back in his chair, arms folded. "So I own a pair of boots. So what? Half the men in this town own boots. That doesn't mean I took her." Vega slid a photograph across the table, the single boot found in Margaret's living room. Dean's jaw tightened. "Funny thing," Vega said evenly. "Your size. Your brand. Your tread pattern. But here's the kicker, you've only got 1 boot left in your house. Where's the other, Dean?" Dean didn't answer. He stared at the wall clock as if he could will the minutes to pass faster. The tension wasn't just in the interrogation room. Out in town, fear was bleeding into suspicion. Margaret's face stared out from every lamppost and shop window. People whispered about old grudges, family secrets, debts unpaid. Then came the second blow. The burner phone that had called Margaret was pinged again, this time from a cell phone tower 30 miles north, in a town called Maple Ridge. The call was brief, just like before. This time it was placed to another landline, one registered to a vacant farmhouse owned by an elderly man who had died the year before. Rourke and Vega drove out to Maple Ridge at first light. The farmhouse was in disrepair, peeling paint, sagging porch, windows clouded with grime. But when they forced the back door, the air inside was wrong. Not the stale emptiness of a long-abandoned place, but the faint scent of wood smoke, coffee, and something metallic. Blood, maybe. On the kitchen table sat a ceramic mug, still warm to the touch. Beside it, a pack of cigarettes. And in the ashtray, a single lipstick-smudged butt. Vega took a slow breath. Margaret doesn't smoke. They swept the house. Upstairs, one room had been cleared except for an old iron bed frame with no mattress. On the floor beside it lay a length of rope and a wool blanket, crumpled, still bearing the warmth of a body recently there. In the corner of that room, Rourke found something that stopped him cold. A small, framed photograph of 2 young women. One was Margaret, the other, the same dark-haired woman from the photo in the library book. But here, both of them were older, maybe in their 30s, and dressed for winter, standing in front of the very same farmhouse they were standing in now. On the back of the frame, February 18th, we keep our promise. Vega whispered, February 18? That's next week. It wasn't lost on either of them that the same date had been scrawled on the ledger scrap found in the boot. Whatever was going to happen, or whatever had happened before, was tied to that date. The deeper they dug, the stranger it became. Town records showed that the dark-haired woman was Caroline Watts, the very woman who had vanished 14 years earlier. Officially, she was still a missing person. No body ever found. Rourke began to see the outlines of a story no one wanted to believe. Margaret Ellison and Caroline Watts were deeply connected. Enough that both disappearances bore the same eerie trademarks, enough that the same names and dates appeared in both cases. Back at the station, Dean Holloway clammed up entirely, asking for a lawyer. Without more evidence, they couldn't hold him. But Rourke wasn't ready to let go. He knew that people like Dean didn't just drift into a crime like this, they were pulled into it, bound by something old and dangerous. And that's when the envelope arrived. No return address. No postmark. Just slipped under the station door sometime in the night. Inside was a single photograph, Margaret, alive, sitting in a chair in a bare room. Her hands were tied, but her eyes were open, calm. Too calm. On the back of the photo, in the same faint pencil as before, not again. Rourke stared at it for a long time, the edges trembling between his fingers. This wasn't just a message. It was a dare. The photograph of Margaret, alive but bound, changed everything. It was proof she was still out there, and proof that whoever took her was willing to play games. Detective Caleb Rourke and Detective Marisol Vega locked themselves in the briefing room that night, laying out every scrap of evidence under the harsh fluorescent lights. They pinned the new photo to the center of the corkboard, a web of red string radiating out toward the farmhouse, the boot print, the burner phone, and Caroline Watts' unsolved disappearance 14 years earlier. February 18th loomed large on their board. 5 days away. Vega traced the date with her fingertip. "It's a deadline," she said flatly. "Either they'll kill her that day, or something else. Either way, we're running out of time." But Rourke wasn't convinced it was only about Margaret. The date had appeared too many times, the ledger scrap, the back of the framed photo in the farmhouse, and now echoing in his own memory from the Caroline Watts file. He dug into the archives until he found it, a decades-old police report about a winter carnival accident on February 18, 1989. The report described 2 girls, Margaret Ellison and Caroline Watts, both then teenagers, found unconscious near the frozen Willow Creek River. Witnesses said they'd been trying to rescue a boy who'd fallen through the ice. The boy hadn't survived. His name, Daniel Holloway, Dean Holloway's younger brother. Rourke sat back, the weight of the connection settling over him. Dean had been 17 at the time. He'd watched his brother die while the 2 girls lived. That kind of wound didn't heal, it festered. Vega leaned in. If Dean blamed them, if he thought they were responsible? Rourke nodded slowly. Then he's been waiting decades for this. And February 18th? It's not just a date to him. It's an anniversary. The next morning, they brought Dean back in. He didn't deny knowing about the carnival accident. In fact, he leaned forward across the table, eyes burning. "You have no idea what they did. My brother didn't have to die that night. They made a choice. They left him." Vega kept her voice calm. "Dean, that was 34 years ago. That doesn't explain why you took Margaret." Dean smirked. "You think I took her?" "No, detective. I delivered her." Rourke's stomach tightened. "To who?" Dean didn't answer. Instead, he tapped the table once with his finger, then sat back. "You'll see." An hour later, Dean's lawyer arrived, and they had to let him go again. But the statement rattled Rourke. If Dean wasn't holding Margaret, then someone else was, someone Dean had been waiting to hand her to. The lead came from a surprising place, a retired sheriff's deputy named Walter Briggs, who had worked the Caroline Watts case. He called Rourke after hearing about Margaret's disappearance in the news. "There's something you should know," Briggs said over the phone. The night Caroline vanished, Dean Holloway wasn't the only one sniffing around. There was a woman, mid-40s, dark hair. She claimed to be Caroline's aunt. Name was Lorraine Watts. But here's the thing, there's no Lorraine Watts in the family. Never was. Rourke's pulse quickened. A fake relative. A fabricated identity. It fit the pattern too well. Vega tracked down an old composite sketch of Lorraine Watts. When they compared it to grainy footage from a convenience store near the farmhouse in Maple Ridge, taken just 2 nights before Margaret vanished, the resemblance was undeniable. The same woman, decades older, now with streaks of gray in her hair. Rourke spread the photos side by side on the desk. So, Caroline disappears in 2009. Lorraine is there. Margaret disappears in 2023. Lorraine is here again. That's not coincidence. But there was still the question of why. Why after so many years? The answer came from forensics. The lipstick on the cigarette butt from the farmhouse matched DNA from the original Caroline Watts case file, specifically, from a scarf Caroline had been wearing the night she vanished. Which meant only one thing. Caroline Watts was alive. Alive, and the one holding Margaret Ellison. The realization hit Rourke hard. This wasn't about revenge for a dead boy. This was about something older, deeper, a pact between 2 women bound by a night in 1989, by guilt and survival. And now, for reasons they didn't yet understand, Caroline had decided it was Margaret's turn to vanish. Vega stared at the board. If Caroline's been hiding all this time, where would she take her? Rourke looked at the farmhouse photo, at the woods behind it. His gut told him the answer wasn't far. Somewhere she thinks no one will look. Somewhere tied to that night. And February 18th was coming. By the time February 16th arrived, Detective Caleb Rourke and Detective Marisol Vega were running on little more than caffeine and instinct. The evidence board in their cramped office looked like a web spun by a frantic spider, every thread leading back to two names, Margaret Ellison and Caroline Watts. They knew Caroline was alive. They knew she had Margaret. And they knew February 18th was more than a date. It was a ritual, an anniversary rooted in a tragedy from 1989. What they didn't know was where Caroline was hiding now. Vega's breakthrough came from an unexpected place, old tax records. She'd been combing through property sales in Maple Ridge and Willow Creek when she found a parcel of land purchased in 2001 by someone using the name Lorraine Watts. No one had lived there full-time for years, but satellite images showed a small cabin deep in the woods, accessible only by a narrow service road. Rourke stared at the image on Vega's monitor. That's her. That's where she's keeping Margaret. They moved fast, assembling a small search team. But the woods were dense, and snow had fallen overnight, blurring tracks. They drove as far as they could before continuing on foot. The cold gnawed at them, the silence pressing in like a held breath. Half a mile in, they found tire tracks, fresh. Rourke knelt to study them. The tread matched a late-model SUV, likely the same black one spotted leaving Willow Creek the night Margaret vanished. He exchanged a glance with Vega. They were close. The cabin appeared suddenly through the trees, its roof heavy with snow, a thin plume of smoke curling from the chimney. There were no lights in the windows, no sound but the creak of trees shifting in the wind. The search team fanned out, approaching cautiously. Vega whispered into her radio, "Rourke, movement inside." One figure. Rourke gave the signal, and the team breached the door. The air inside was thick with wood smoke and the faint tang of unwashed linen. Against the far wall sat a woman, Margaret Ellison, bound to a wooden chair, her face pale but alert. Her eyes locked on Rourke's, and for the first time in weeks, hope flickered there. But Caroline Watts was nowhere to be seen. Vega rushed to free Margaret while Rourke swept the cabin. The place was sparsely furnished. A bed, a table, a single kerosene lamp casting trembling shadows. On the table lay a stack of photographs. Every single one showed Margaret, some recent, others clearly taken without her knowledge over the past year. And beneath them, another stack, photographs of Caroline and Margaret together as teenagers. Vega's voice cut through his thoughts. "She's weak, but she's okay. Says Caroline left about an hour ago. Alone." Rourke's gut sank. An hour was enough for Caroline to vanish again into the woods. Margaret's voice trembled as she spoke. She wanted me to remember. She kept saying, "We made a promise." She talked about Daniel. About that night on the ice. She said this time, she wouldn't be the one to disappear. Rourke crouched beside her. Did she say where she was going? Margaret shook her head. "See you on the 18th. Back at the station, the clock was ticking louder than ever. If Caroline had slipped away now, it was because she had something planned, something that could unfold in just 2 days. Vega spread out the photographs from the cabin. She's been watching Margaret for months. Maybe years. This wasn't spur of the moment, it's been building. Rourke nodded grimly. And if she's planning something for the anniversary, we might only get one shot to stop it. The unanswered question hung heavy in the room. Was February 18th the day Caroline intended to kill Margaret, or the day she intended to vanish with her for good? The morning of February 18th was gray and brittle, the kind of winter day that felt like it could splinter if you breathed too hard. Detective Caleb Rourke had been at his desk since before sunrise, coffee gone cold beside him, eyes locked on the clock. Caroline Watts hadn't been seen since slipping away from the cabin 2 days earlier. Every highway patrol and rural deputy within 100 miles had been alerted. Still, no sightings. Margaret Ellison was recovering at the hospital, physically safe but unable, or unwilling, to say more about her time in captivity. Vega walked in with a file in her hand. "We've got something," she said. "Trail cam footage, taken late last night about a mile from the Willow Creek River. She laid out a sequence of grainy black and white images. A woman in a dark parka, face partially obscured, walking along the frozen bank. Caroline. Rourke didn't hesitate. Within an hour, they were trudging along that same riverbank, their breath ghosting in the frigid air. Snow squeaked beneath their boots. Somewhere ahead, a lone crow called out, sharp, echoing. They found her standing on the ice. Caroline Watts, older now but still carrying the steel of the woman who had outwitted everyone for 14 years, turned as they approached. Her eyes moved past Rourke, past Vega, to some point in the distance only she could see. I told her, Caroline said softly. I told Margaret it would be her turn. Rourke's voice was steady. It's over, Caroline. Whatever you think this is, it ends here. She gave a small, almost pitying smile. You think you can close this like a case file? This is a promise. A debt. Vega took a step closer. You lost Daniel. We know. But punishing Margaret won't bring him back. Caroline's gaze hardened. It was never about bringing him back. It was about making sure someone remembered. She stepped back onto the thicker ice, the surface creaking faintly beneath her boots. Rourke's hand twitched toward her, but she shook her head. Some debts, she said, are only paid in full when the ledger is clean. And then she was gone. One moment she was there, the next the ice beneath her gave way with a crack that echoed through the trees. She didn't thrash or scream, just slipped into the black water like it had been waiting for her. By the time Rourke reached the edge, there was nothing left but ripples freezing back into silence. Two weeks later, the river thawed. Caroline's body was never recovered. Margaret returned to her home in Willow Creek. She spoke little to reporters, avoiding the questions that hung like frost in the air. In the church pews at the grocery store, people still whispered about the night on the ice in 1989, about the strange bond between the two women, about whether Margaret had truly been a victim or just fulfilling her end of a bargain. For Rourke and Vega, the file stayed open longer than most. There were too many loose threads, too much about the past no one was willing to speak aloud. But eventually, even this case was moved to the archive room, another box on a dusty shelf. Rourke often thought about something Margaret had told him quietly, when no one else was listening. We all keep promises, detective. The only difference between me and her is that mine didn't have to end in water. The case left a mark deeper than any arrest could have. In a town where everyone thought they knew each other's lives, it was a reminder that some histories are buried under ice so thick, it takes decades to crack. And when they do, the truth isn't clean. It's cold, murky, and tangled in the choices we made when we were young. It was also a warning. The weight of guilt, carried long enough, will find a way to pass itself on. The question is, will you hand it to someone else, or will you finally set it down?